Hello, and welcome to this video on strengthening proposals for cross-sector impact. I am Heather Tallis, and I'm the Secretariat Chair of the Bridge Collaborative, which is a global partnership among the Nature Conservancy, the International Food Policy Research Institute, Duke University, and PATH. These organizations came together in this partnership because we each recognize that the challenges that we're trying to address globally are strongly interconnected across health, development, and the environment. For example, as you can see in this image about several of the Sustainable Development Goals connected to sanitation challenges, most of the issues that we try to address today really are strongly interconnected. And yet, most of the solutions that we put forward still are not. We still tend to start with our traditional slice of the issue, health or development or environment interventions, bringing just that piece to the table when we know the issues and challenges are integrated. So the Bridge Collaborative aims to change that and directly support more cross-sector solutions to the challenges we all face today. One of the ways that the Bridge Collaborative aims to support that change is by strengthening teams' abilities to put forward ideas for cross-sector impact, or interventions that are likely to cause benefits across multiple scopes across health, development, and environment. One of the ways that we did this was through the Bridge Spark Fund, which was a fund that we managed in 2019, putting forward funding opportunities for research and practitioner teams to advance solutions across health, development, and environment. As part of this fund, we created a boot camp that supported proposing teams in strengthening their ideas. We've now generalized the workbook that was developed for that boot camp, and it's now available on our website. And the materials there and in the video today are really meant for teams that already have proposals, primarily starting from a single sector entry point, and wish to improve them, expanding their view and adding additional impacts. This is not a systematic planning approach or comprehensive in terms of addressing all aspects of research or implementation planning. We've picked out key issues that we see teams struggle with the most as they expand their lenses beyond a single sector. The workbook covers two main topics: expanding beyond single sector impact and strengthening visions for scale. This video addresses the first topic, and there's a separate video on our website that addresses strengthening scaling. So let's get into expanding beyond single sector impact. As I mentioned, there's increasing recognition that the challenges that we face around the world today are really interconnected. And in the last year and a half, we've seen an even further intensification of that realization and additional calls to look beyond single sectors. For example, the increasing impacts of climate change have led to increased calls for climate considerations in public health programs. The increasing attention to racial inequalities around the world has led to calls for equity considerations in environmental conservation efforts that are reckoning with their own racist pasts in many cases. And of course, the global COVID-19 pandemic has led for very strong calls for integration of economic recovery and pandemic preparedness thinking. These are just some examples of how the intensity of these connections are being brought to the fore, and research and practitioner teams are increasingly being asked by leaders and by funders to put forward solutions that address multiple aspects of a problem. As teams shift to respond to those calls, we see some challenges in being specific about how current programs can add new impacts. One of the main challenges we see is that teams may understand a general connection to a new area of interest or a new impact, but not be able to put that into specific concrete terms for how an intervention or a program might cause new additional changes. Here's some examples of the kinds of language that we see as teams start to develop initial ideas going beyond their primary areas of interest. For example, we might see a conservation team aiming to increase protected area coverage by 30% and improve community health, having a vague notion that the environment is connected to human health, but not really clear enough on that idea to specify how and how their program is likely to have health impacts. We might see a development team interested in diversifying household income sources and aiding climate adaptation, Another broad general idea that's probably connected to human development in many ways, but here we don't really see that specific understanding of what aspects of climate adaptation might be connected to household incomes and might be improved by this program. Or we might see a nutrition team aiming to decrease undernutrition rates by 10% and contribute to equity, a very broad idea that's likely associated with food systems and household diet options, but this doesn't really specify what aspects of equity this team might be able to address. So this is a challenge we often see, this general starting point that needs to be made more specific and more concrete so that teams understand what types of impacts they can actually have beyond their normal sphere of influence. So where to start in getting more specific? There are many resources available, and I'll point to just two here. First, FHI 360 has the development sector adjacency map, which is a great starting point if you're not sure what general other sectors your approaches might be relevant to. And if you'd like to go into a little more detail, the Bigger Change Faster report put out by the Bridge Collaborative and UNDP looks at the strongest interconnections among several of the Sustainable Development Goals and gives specific connections that you might consider based on an SDG starting point that might be your primary focus. To just go a little further with that example, here are some specific challenges highlighted in the Bigger Change Faster report. These pull out some of those strongest interconnections that have been identified in research and in the literature, and ties them together so that teams that might focus on one SDG can quickly understand which others might be tightly associated with the work that they do. As just one example, on the left here, we have accelerating a low carbon, clean air, and environmentally friendly future for all. If you're a team that traditionally works on climate action, this might give you ideas for how your interventions are connected to energy access, health risks from air pollution, and energy infrastructure risks for natural environments on land, in rivers, and in the ocean. I won't go through each of these examples, but this just gives you a sense of some of the guidance that can be found in the Bigger Change Faster report that identifies these strong interconnections as a starting point to explore further. Once you have these starting points, it can be useful to use logic models or causal pathways to draw out the likely connections between your project or your interventions and those additional impacts that you can identify with the resources I just mentioned. It's common to use these kinds of logic models in planning processes across health development and environment, so this can be a consistent starting point for expanding project ideas. Some programs use verbal logic models or theories of change, as you can see on the left, and some use visual representations or conceptual models, as in the middle. If you're interested in developing these types of conceptual models, the Bridge Collaborative has an additional practitioner's guide that you can find on our website that has guidance and recommendations for how to build cross-sector conceptual models. To give one example of what that looks like, going back to our Bigger Change Faster challenges, we could start here with this sanitation and wastewater improvement approach. Let's say you have a program that traditionally approaches the SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation, and you've now learned from this list of challenge elements that there's likely to be connections to freshwater or marine biodiversity from those types of work, and you want to explore that further. So you might have a logic model that looks something like this in a very generic form at a high level, where your interventions might include installing sanitation technology and providing services to high-need communities, and using local champions and communication campaigns to increase acceptability of that technology and those services. You anticipate that those interventions will lead to the sanitation options being used, maintained, and the waste being treated. And you anticipate that leading to a more traditional single sector impact of safe sanitation access and wastewater treatment being secured. You anticipate another pathway where sewage pollution in local water sources is decreased, leading to another health outcome of diarrheal disease risk reduction. From our challenge list, you've gotten the sense that there might be a third impact around environmental health, but this is still general and vague, and so you can develop this concept further looking at the literature or speaking with experts about what this pathway really might look like. And by digging in further, you might learn that improving sewage pollution in local water sources is likely to decrease that pollution in sensitive freshwater species habitats, improving those habitats and leading to a third impact in the environment sphere, where sensitive freshwater species become delisted as threatened and their populations improve. This is just one example of how you can use these kinds of logic models to draw out additional connections between your existing program or proposals and additional impacts outside your traditional sphere of influence. You might go further in testing the assumptions in this logic model to make sure that all members of the team are on the same page about what you're expecting. And then you could go even further to see if existing evidence supports or refutes your assumptions, depending on the needs of decision makers as you develop your proposal. For example, just walking through this same logic model again, you can reveal what some of the major assumptions are in each of these arrows. For example, the first main assumption here is that the 2 interventions that are being planned are sufficient to ensure the use and maintenance of the sanitation technologies and services. So that's something that you can talk about within your team or look at the evidence to see whether or not that's likely to be true. A second major assumption of this logic model now with the new chain linking to freshwater systems is that the expected reduction in pollution is enough to be biologically meaningful, so that the sewage pollution here is actually a major driver of decline for the sensitive species of concern. This is again something that you can clarify within your team, see if you all agree that this is likely to be true, or check with the literature or experts to test the validity of this assumption. Just writing down the assumptions can be powerful, especially if you're adding new members to your team or expanding your expertise. In some cases, funders or leaders may ask for actual evidence review to understand the certainty that you have that these new additional outcomes are likely to happen. In that case, you can get into a difficult situation where evidence is being brought together from many different disciplines to look at the strength of evidence and confidence that you have in a various set of outcomes. For example, a health impact, a development impact, and an environment impact. Those disciplines think about evidence quite differently, and so teams can be challenged to synthesize evidence across their entire logic models and be consistent in their thinking about the strength of evidence. To help address this challenge, the Bridge Collaborative developed an evidence evaluation rubric that was agreed to by over 120 experts from health development and environment and published in the Current Opinion Environmental Sustainability and also summarized in the Practitioner's Guide. This is a very straightforward rubric, similar to what's used by, for example, the Cochrane Collaborative or by the IPCC in the environment sphere. But this includes a set of considerations for strength of evidence that was agreed to by experts across all disciplines. So this could be a useful starting point if you are going to do a systematic review of evidence for additional impacts across multiple disciplines. Here's one example of an evidence review that was done on a logic model for oyster reef restoration in the Gulf of Mexico. After the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, millions of dollars are being invested in restoration with the intention of improving the environment and improving human health and community resilience and economic outcomes. This model, which is quite busy, gives one example of how a typical type of restoration for oyster reef recovery might resonate through the system and cause changes in aspects of human health, economic activity, and cultural values. We won't go into detail here, but a systematic review was done to assess the strength of evidence for each of the links in this model. And you can see the different colors here where high strength of evidence in green is shown or low strength of evidence in purple, giving an idea of which parts of this model are really supported by current literature and which are less so. So if we just narrow in on the strongly supported links, you can see how doing a systematic review can really help clarify which aspects of the system are really likely to respond to a certain intervention or a program. So this just gives one example of how you can use evidence evaluation to further improve your understanding and the clarity of the logic as you add additional impacts beyond your initial sector. So in general, as teams think about expanding beyond single sector impacts, it can be useful to ask a set of questions that's summarized here. As a starting point, what are the plausible impacts outside your sector, and have you considered them all? I've introduced some resources that could be useful to identify starting points for checking whether or not that consideration has been broad enough. You might then ask, how can your approach cause those additional impacts that are suggested by the initial resources? And here, logic models or causal models can help draw out those connections and check the understanding of the team and alignment on which impacts are most likely to happen. And then you might ask if your logic is clear and supported by evidence. Depending on the needs of the team and the funder and its leadership, you may just simply state assumptions and make sure the team is all on the same page about what the expected changes are and what those changes depend on. You may go further and actually evaluate the evidence as relevant and estimate impacts. And the rubric that I showed can be a useful tool for systematic reviews when evidence evaluation is used. These are some initial steps that teams can take as they start to expand their scope and thinking beyond single sector impacts to multi-sector outcomes. As you all know, today's challenges really do call for these kinds of integrated solutions, and we hope that the materials here can be helpful as teams expand their scope and do more to build out these kinds of solutions. If you'd like more information or the workbook that I mentioned, you can find it on our website, and feel free to contact us anytime at info@bridgecollaborative.org. Thank you.